Hello everyone, and welcome to Spring Celebration. I'm Suzanne Underwood Rhodes, and I live in Fayetteville, and I'm just so happy to be here with you today. Thank you for dropping in to hear my little talk, and I just want to thank you, Frida Patton, for inviting me. I feel so honored to get to be the keynote speaker today. Frida, I know you work very, very hard as the president of our organization to make sure that poetry thrives and stays alive in our state. So thank you for your good efforts. And I want to recognize the other volunteers and leaders in the PRA who also devote their time, their effort, and energy to the contests, to the membership, to the website, and all the things that are involved in poetry promotion. And I know what's involved because I moved here 3 years ago from Virginia Beach. I was very active in the Poetry Society of Virginia, and so there's a lot of work that goes on. So there's a lot to celebrate today. It's spring, which is wonderful. After a long winter, things are opening up. Flowers are blooming, and not only is it a spring celebration for PRA, but of course, as you know, it's also National Poetry Month, and I'm so glad our government has recognized the importance of poetry in our world. Especially now with the pandemic, it seems that poetry is kind of awakening people to the deeper realities, that poetry has a special and redemptive power to bring to light. People are doing more soul searching and spending more time contemplating the deeper issues of life. I also have a personal blessing to celebrate, and that is the release of my new book of poems, Flying Yellow, which is published by PRA Press and was just released on April 1st. And it's available through paracletepress.org, as well as Amazon and the other major companies. So I'm really, really happy to be able to see the fruit of my own loving labors. And I have to tell you that these poems were written over a period of 7 years, most of them were, and they were hard-earned poems. I went through a serious illness, had 2 terrible family tragedies, lost a job, my career job of 13 years, and of course a major move across the country from Virginia. And yet there's plenty of light that comes through the cracks, even in hard times, and so I'm certainly grateful to be able to see my flying yellow fledge. Now I'm going to be sharing some of the poems from my book to illustrate points that I wish to make in this talk. I also want to mention that I've taught writing and literature for many years to colleges and universities, public schools, private schools, to children from kindergarten all the way up to seniors 80 plus years old. And now I'm teaching virtually at the Muse Writer Center in Norfolk, Virginia. This is one of the premier writing centers in the country. And now that it's virtual, anyone can sign up for their classes, and they also offer scholarships. But you can take screenwriting, memoir, poetry, fiction, flash fiction, and business writing. So check it out, themusewritercenter.org, if you're interested in growing in your craft. Now, in my own writing, I rely heavily on imagery and also on the musical aspects of language, which I absolutely adore. As Robert Frost said, the ear is the only true writer and the only true reader. And so it's this mingling of sounds among the words and in the lines that I follow. I follow the music. And of course I draw from the other literary tools that we have at our disposal: metaphor, simile, personification, and all the rest. So my topic today is Real Toads in Imaginary Gardens, the Power of Imagery in Your Poems. The line you may recognize is from Marianne Moore's poem, poetry. And she starts out very tartly saying, I too dislike it, which I think is really great. She goes on with characteristic humor, irony, and insight to say that what really matters is the raw stuff of life, hands that can grasp, hair that can rise. This is what we're after, imaginary gardens with real toads in them. So the garden of your poem, that is the imaginative and fertile ground from which your words arise. This garden must have in it real toads, what we call verisimilitude, that rather unattractive Latinate word that means the appearance of being true or real. You can't taste an abstract word like majestic. You can't smell an abstraction like discouragement or compassion. You can't touch honesty. You can't see freedom. These words refer to ideas and concepts that have no physical reference. Because the fabric of poetry is a sensory fabric, your poems need to be built primarily on images. As William Carlos Williams breaks it down into this simple phrase, no ideas but in things. And if you're not familiar with that phrase, write it down on a sticky note, put it on your monitor of your computer, because the idea that we don't explain in poetry, we don't use the abstract words, as Rapound said, go in fear of abstractions. Not that you can't use abstractions, but you should prefer imagery and concrete language. T.S. Eliot calls it the objective correlative, and your grade school teachers called it show, don't tell. Now, besides the aesthetic pleasures of poetry, and they are many indeed, and in the wintertime when there's a few brittle leaves that are still clinging to the branches, I think of Shakespeare's marvelous line. He describes the leaves as bare, ruined choirs that shake against the cold. I think also of Emily Dickinson's line, the steeples swam in amethyst, from her poem, I'll Tell You How the Sun Rose, a poem I just love. But besides these pleasures that we experience when we read poetry, there's also science behind the impact of imagery on the brain. Now, if you're like me, there are certain recipes, if I read them or see a commercial or something and hear about them, they make my mouth water just to read them. Here's one for you. Juicy smothered pork chops, seared and cooked in a rich onion gravy, is a delicious and easy dinner recipe perfect for any night of the week. Not for the faint-hearted, you can serve them with anything. Think mashed potatoes or white rice to soak up the delicious sauce. Or how about homemade cinnamon rolls are gooey and fluffy with tons of cream cheese frosting on top. Now, I don't eat those foods anymore, but they sure do make me drool when I read about them. Do you know we salivate because of the brain's limbic system? Sensory images produce physiological responses such as goosebumps, salivation, rapid heartbeat. Emily Dickinson understood it and famously said, "If I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold no fire can warm me, I know that is poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry." Now, I'd like to pick up on the idea of an image as a resonant word picture. It's more than a mere representation of something, a specific detail like curly hair or brown rice. It's not a word snapshot that we respond to by saying, well, what do you know? The peony looks exactly like that. Big pink blooms. No, an image carries emotional weight and evocative appeal. An empty doorway, a blood-stained rug, a cluster of grapes spilling over the bowl's edge. John Chardy said, imagery is best defined as the total sensory suggestion of poetry. And Ezra Pound defines image as an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. Think about that. The image freezes the moment, and it's charged with unspoken feeling and thought. Consider his famous poem, In a Station at the Metro, which I've put up here. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. So the faces are fleeting and ghostly, glimpsed through the impersonal backdrop of the hurried commute, the rush of time. In a poem, the peony I mentioned earlier rises not only from the eye, but from the ground of imagination, taking what the eye has seen and remaking it into something more, a songburst of spring, a woman's sensuality. Compare these two examples from a poem. The first is, I'll read, the pointed nib of her calligraphy pen dips, presses, and lifts. And the second, her pen strokes are ribbons of silken script. Now in the first we have a very precise description of the calligrapher's pen and its process. These are good words, but they fail to have any kind of emotional connection that we feel. Now in the second, we're drawn by the fluid motion and we feel the silken stroke. Our sensory and emotional experience is enlarged in a way that the technical words of the first example can't deliver. Now this isn't to say that a poem can't use technical words. I'm not saying that at all. They may be necessary to the poem's purpose. But here I'm using the lines just to show contrast. The other thing about images is that they deliver the power of surprise. They arrest us. And there's a recognition that goes on when we see that a bumblebee is a jar of velvet masonry, as Emily said. They let us see with feeling. Surprise is one of the most important elements of poetry, and indeed of all good writing. It's like seeing the first spring crocus. And for me, one of the sprightliest joys of writing poetry is the element of surprise. So aim for freshness and discovery in your poems. Cutting Hair is the title of a poem that I'm going to read from my book. This poem uses all the tools, all the techniques that I'm describing here: imagery, figures of speech, rhythm, and sound associations. These are vehicles to convey a sorrowful experience that is rimmed with a glimmer of hope. And this is called Cutting Hair. On the day to cut your hair, the sun has shaken its shaggy mane of light over the near ocean, over the trees behind our house after a night of hunting, after birds have refilled the trees and death has slipped into the deep woods, its memory scant as a snail's thread on the patio. I wrap you in a cape and snug it with a clip. How careful I must be, rounding your good ear with scissors, the ear my tongue loves to kiss, apricot sweet, and loves too the bad ear and its ghosts. I thread your hair with a comb to gauge length, silver in my loom. I cut your hair in rhythm, remembering the day you shaved what was left of mine, how we walked on a trail through the marsh, through tufts of fog, and I was slow as soup of low tide, slow against your arm, remembering what it was like not to lean, to be bright in my bones. I see light differently now, painting the branches behind our house, early before you're awake. It's more the gold of afterlife, I think, a glimpse before bodies take on all that death. So, how do we bring all of these things to a practical application to our own writing? Well, here are a few suggestions, and that's what they are. They're suggestions. If you have a creative process that's working for you and you're producing poems that you're happy with, then stay with that process. But maybe there are a few things you can pick up. The first is silence yourself. Leave your devices and distractions and find a place to be still. For me, it's the stillness of God that is my garden. Listen to the quiet. Second, wait and be patient. For me, writing poetry is an intensely spiritual experience that involves waiting for pieces of the poem to arise like a flotilla of gulls from the ocean. Allow impressions, feelings, memories to come and visualize them. Even before the words, visualize those. And the more you see and hear in your mind, the more fruitful will be your words. This happened to me as I wrote the next poem I'd like to read. And since we're talking about gardens, I've chosen to read Nettie. This is a poem about my grandmother. She was a farmer who lived in northern Alabama in a farming community. And after the funeral, we went there and attended the funeral and took care of some matters. And the day that we left, it was springtime. I think it was in March, yes. And of course, Alabama is a warmer state. And everything was in bloom. But what I noticed most was this blazing forsythia bush. And that's the image that shimmered in my mind that led to this poem. It's called Nettie. Her name was Nettie Pearl Robinson, a wonderful woman. Nettie, she went out in forsythia, a yellow day bursting over fields once ablaze with corn and cotton, over the road buried in asphalt that leveled it, but it's still breathing underneath, pure dirt, hard as a laborer's back, a road that follows the earth's curve. The tall weeds walk up and down, singing alongside, and I was the girl walking with them, telling stories to the wind. Strange I wasn't sadder. Grandma's laughter was always wanting out, teased her mouth into a grin, but had to hold itself in for the worry sometimes, and she could worry better than anyone in Morgan County. Storms, the boys running moonshine, Aunt Mattie going blind, and my mother, the beauty among brothers, with fire in her mind. That morning was the last time I breathed the simple air. There's no one left to pick the small, sweet jewels of time, strawberries from her garden. But what if your mind is blank? What if you're sitting in front of your computer screen or your tablet of paper and nothing comes at all? If you've never read William Stafford's essay, A Way of Writing, I highly recommend it. And if you have read it, you might want to reread it, because it's both a practical and affirming piece of writing where he talks about being receptive, being like a fisherman waiting for a nibble on the line. He said, to get started, I will accept anything that occurs to me. He also said we should be willing to fail. Not every line that you write is going to work. Not every poem you write is going to be good. It might even be terrible. But the main thing is to be there and to be receptive. And sometimes it's the case where you might come up with a really good image or phrase for a poem, but it doesn't quite fit there. So I think of that as a scrap that I can put in my rag bag and perhaps put it in another poem on another occasion. The important thing, he says, is that you found a process and a practice that leads to freedom, adventure, forgiveness. That's huge. Discovery and satisfaction. Seeking outside stimulation is also helpful. And by stimulation, I don't mean excitement, but I mean being in a place, like being in nature, where you can absorb your environment, the beautiful trees, the sky, the creatures, and so forth. I love to hike and to spend time in nature, so there's so much to fascinate and inspire. Also, listening to music or viewing artworks can also be stimulating sources for poems. And then there are the poetry challenges that we regularly get from the PRA, a really good way to generate poems. Another resource you may be familiar with is the poetsandwriters.org website. Check out the poetry prompts that are there every Tuesday. Also, it's good to read contemporary poetry, classic poetry, and to read them often. Read a poem a day. The Poetry Foundation website is a rich source of poems, and then also essays and biographies. Branch out to discover new poets, subjects, forms, and styles. There are many fine anthologies available as well. I happened to pick this one up at the library, Poems to Read by Robert Penske. And then there's also the Best American Poetry series. Another one that I like is called Poems of Devotion, edited by and collected by Luke Hankins. And these are beautiful works of devotional poetry. Now, next, as you write, allow the images to create beauty and meaning. For all the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf, as Archibald MacLeish writes in Ars Poetica. And then there's this little haiku from Issa, the Japanese poet. On a branch, floating down river, a cricket singing. Isn't that beautiful? Not only is it beautiful, but it's the best representation of what poetry is and should be that I've ever seen. Think of it. The branch is the vehicle, the genre of poetry. On a branch, floating down river, makes us think of the flow of language, the cadences, rhythms, the heartbeat of a poem, the fluid movement. And then the cricket, a cricket singing, that's the word. Yes, and the word is singing. Next, view writing as discovery. It's not a predetermined blueprint. As you yourself are surprised by words and images that open the window of insight, so will you surprise and deepen your readers. Next, aim for density in your poems. Density is the compression, the distillation, the economy of language that gives poetry its singular power and charge, language charged with meaning, as Perrine has said. Think of a hefty, home-baked loaf of bread with whole grains and rich flavor and nutrition, as opposed to a loaf of white bread, commercial white bread that you can squeeze like an accordion. As we've seen, density is achieved through the use of imagery, as well as by the selection of resonant, charged words, and by reducing and even eliminating adjectives, adverbs, abstractions, and needless verbiage. In fact, in the poetry workshop that I'm currently teaching for the Muse, one of my students, we met last night, and he said, I've been eliminating adjectives and adverbs from my poems and relying on the strong nouns and verbs instead. And, he's pretty excited because his poetry has just improved so much and really, really fine. So that's what I recommend. And then, of course, one of the most powerful ways to achieve density is through figurative language. Why poets so often fail to use metaphor and simile, apostrophe, irony, symbolism. It's really a shame not to use what we have available. That's what makes poetry poetry. I used to play a game with my children when they were small, and it was a game of making metaphors and similes. And so here's my son, just a little guy, about 4 or 5, and we're walking through the grocery store, and we passed by the freshly roasted ground coffee. And when he smelled it, and he goes, "Oh, it's music to my nose." On another occasion, our family's driving in South Carolina for vacation, and as we went farther south, we began to see Spanish moss. And I said to my daughter, Katie, I said, "What does the Spanish moss remind you of?" And she said, "A lady's shawl," which is so perfect. And I added, "A lady's shawl dripping from the shoulders of trees." You can see more through metaphor, and you can see with feeling. Also, revise to find out what the poem wants to be. For me, revision is where the real writing occurs. It's the refinement that cuts away the noise. And I think of a poem, once you write a poem, in the process of it, the poem belongs to you. But once you've written the poem, you belong to the poem. And you need to develop that objectivity to see what the poem wants to be. Now you can also join a workshop, a writer's group, something like that, or have a trusted poet friend to help you see objectively. And again, you want to eliminate those abstractions, adverbs, excessive adjectives, explanations, cliches, trite expressions, and prosaic sentences. If the words sound kind of familiar, they're probably pretty tired words and you need to find fresher, more robust words. So substitute weak verbs like verbs of being and passive verbs for strong active ones. And then again, you want to find those vibrant, evocative nouns to replace tired ones. Now I'm going to give you an example from a poem by one of my students with her permission, so you can see a difference between two parts of her poem. In the poem, the speaker is the daughter writing about her 100-year-old mother. She says, "I don't want our times to end, disappearing into time's annals, but I can see the future in loved ones who are already gone, husbands, brothers, children, friends pass from the earth daily." Well, that's really a paragraph. It's really prose. It isn't poetry. There's no real engaging imagery. There's no fresh thought. Time's annals is a cliche. Friends pass from the earth daily. We already know that. Poetry being about discovery, we want something more. And she delivers at the end of the poem with these concluding lines. "I want to cling to her, my mama, be held, hold her again like the child I once was, breathe in her scent of dove soap and mint, hear her heartbeat as I curl into her lap." Notice the alliteration there too, and a little bit of rhyme. Scent of dove soap and mint, and you've got those end consonant T's. Hear her heartbeat. Those are really nice effects. Keep in mind again that poetry is distilled language. As Billy Collins said, poetry is a bird, prose is a potato. End your poem with an image, and for that matter, begin your poem with an image. I'm going to read two more poems here. One is called Gray Distances, and it was inspired on a very gray, cold day when my husband and I took a trip to Pea Island Wildlife Refuge in North Carolina. And I remember I wanted to think about a poem, find a poem, and I couldn't. It was just kind of a depressing day, but there was a poem to be discovered, and this is what happened. It's called Gray Distances. The loneliness of their long whistles, the sound full of their whiteness, even in community they are lonely. Miles of loneliness across the rain-beaten water as they have come to overwinter, to fly the gray distances from there to here, to be the wings of longing, to plumb the sky and sea, landing and leaving like arrows from the bow of God, the air crying for love of swans. And then finally, this is a poem I wrote about my grandson. As I said, he's the reason that we moved here to Arkansas. He's 8 years old now. But I thought in this poem, I thought about Marcus and how he was like 2, I think, when I wrote this poem. And I thought about trying to understand the mind and the perception of a very, very small child. And so this is called Royal Morning. He lives out in the country. The child wakes and reaches into pure day, high-wired to test the lay of the crib, to make sure the sheet's firemen are climbing their ladders and the monkey's glass eyes have kept their stare. He tries the wooden bars for strength, shaking them sternly. His legs bounce, happy as frogs, and light spills ever brighter through the split blinds. The ear turns cupward to the fields where rooster and donkey trumpet the hour and a pickup growls through gravel. Oh, glorious day before mother wakes up and the boy is prince of every prancing cloud. So I want to thank you again for dropping in. I hope you'll find some useful things to take away from this lecture. I wish you roses in your garden, but even more, I wish you real toads and dandelions too, because your job as a poet is to unmask what others pass by or belittle, and to declare through your surprising resonant words and images that toads and weeds are beautiful in their way. Thank you. Have a great day.